Well, first of all, thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. In talking about it, and what kind of got me on the list was it might be a little bit different with my experiences how I got in the Navy and how I chose the Navy. It might have been different than the usual thing. But I served in the Navy from July the 9th, 1965 to April the 24th, 1968. Only 2 years, 9 months, 16 days. I took the oath of enlistment the day before I turned 18. And so that made me a kiddie cruiser, a little three-year man. It wasn't my intention to just join early to get the short list and avoid the Army draft. I was going to join and be a 30-year man and retire from the Navy. I thought, I retire at 48, what a deal. I mean, that sounded like a great idea. But other than my time in the service, and for 6 months I worked on the F-111A fighter jet at General Dynamics in Fort Worth. Other than that time, I grew up here in Amarillo. I was a member of the second senior class out of Caprock High School. Remember that growing up was so different for us baby boomers in those early 60s than even for our own kids. They just don't know the way the world was in those early 60s. You'd go hang with your buddies. If somebody had a car, you cruised up and down Polk Street, run around Stanley's, turned around at the north end by the railroad tracks, come back down. Oh yeah, you know those. Drink Cokes and eat French fries and stuff till you were sick all night. And growing up, never had to be told when to be home. When we went out with our buddies, said goodbyes at the house, and they picked me up or I picked them up, and we went. But we knew when to be home. Do you know how? Can you remember how you knew when to be home in those days? The street lamps. When the street lights come on, you headed home. That's exactly right. Oh boy. There's a lot of things that we had in the 60s. If you go back and you look at some of the things that happened in the early part of the 60s, I Love Lucy was on. The cartoons, Roadrunner, Porky Pig, Mickey Mouse, all of the good cartoons were on. None of that weird animated stuff. We also lost Norma Jean in 1962. Servicemen remembered her a lot. Here's Johnny. Johnny Carson started the Tonight Show in 1962. 63, Beach Party films were the hit with all of the kids. 63 was also Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech that he gave. We lost JFK. We had the Selma March. The Astrodome was built in 65. Miniskirts started in 66. And the top football game premiered in 67. Super Bowl, first Super Bowl. Who was that? If everybody remembers anything, it's who was in the first Super Bowl. Green Bay and Kansas City. And Green Bay beat them. They do good. Here's a bunch of Cookie Monster come out. How about the Mrs. Robinson, the movie Mrs. Robinson? You had to sneak into that one almost. It was showing at the Esquire. You told your folks you was going to the State Theater to the movie there. And of course, we had the Man on the Moon, Woodstock, and we lost Dr. Martin Luther King that year as well. And things, Bandstand, Barbie and Ken, The Twist, easy bake ovens, go-go boots, fluffernutters. Anybody remember fluffernutters? Fluffernutters, the rage of the sandwich. Peanut butter and marshmallow cream. I don't know. Tang was the drink of choice with young kids. It tasted absolutely horrible. But John Glenn drank Tang on the space flight, and so everybody started drinking Tang. Horrible stuff. Troll dolls, Etch-a-Sketch, tie-dyed T-shirts and hippies, Jell-O salads that had vegetables in them. You'd put anything in a bowl of Jell-O. God, it's amazing we love. It's amazing we love. G.I. Joe, the Whammo Super Ball, the ball that never quit bouncing. You throw it and you bounce it and it just keep ricocheting and keep right on going. Just some of the things that's what we had in the early 60s. That's what we grew up with. But anyway, it was I had a lot of fun remembering that stuff. And there was another list that had 60-something on it, but I didn't do that one. Remembering your first car. A lot of baby boomers, we got our first car about the early 60s. Biggest problem with those cars, batteries didn't work. Seemed like about half the kids from school was pushing their cars after school and clutch jumping them to get them started. And heaven forbid you should ever honk the horn with the car not running. Beep! Pushing it. It wouldn't work. But all of that come to an end in August of 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin. And in March of 65, we deployed the first 3,500 troops to Vietnam. The world changed. The age of innocence was over. The world will never be the same again as it was in those early 60s. Growing up, I spent a lot of summers and a lot of vacation time at my grandparents' farm in Arkansas. The farmhouse was basically unchanged over all those years. Big old tall, 14-foot high ceilings, wallpaper kind of peeling down in the corners, the mud daubers flying up and you hear them buzzing up there building their little nest up in the corners. Pot-bellied stove in the parlor was the main heat. But they had open flame heaters in each of the bedrooms and stuff, but they'd turn those off at night for safety. Turn them on for a while, but when you went to bed, you turned them off. The kitchen, that was Grandma's domain. Men were not allowed in the kitchen. You get in there, you're going to get that dish towel, that proverbial dish towel slapped on your bottom to get out of her kitchen and leave her alone. There was the breakfast room that you were allowed to go into, but not past it during the working day. You walked in on the utility room, the back porch, you cleaned up at the big old deep sinks and stuff, then you were allowed into the breakfast room. I usually spent all my time playing in the front room of the house, one because it had the least amount of furniture, the open area in the middle, had a unique carpet design that I could use with my toys and stuff, roads and things like that. But over in the corner of that room, there was a knick-knack shelf that my grandfather built from all of the little thread spools that my grandmother had. She crocheted and stuff constantly, so she had those cardboard cones, she had big thread spools. He built her a knick-knack shelf. On that knick-knack shelf was all of the service pictures of our family. My uncles, cousins, aunts, uncles, my dad, they were all there. All of their pictures was on that knick-knack shelf. And then on the wall beside that knick-knack shelf was all of their group pictures. their boot camp company. Maybe it was the squadron they served in, or they worked on the planes for that squadron. That's where they were. So I grew up looking at those pictures and seeing those pictures. They were all Navy, every one of them. Some were in their dress blues, some were in their working dungarees, but it was their pictures, and I saw that. And somehow through those years, I knew that it was my obligation, not only to my country, but to my family, that I joined the Navy. So I graduated from high school, and in less than a month, I went through all of the stuff. Because I was going to be underage, I had to get my parents' signature, and they were reluctant. They finally gave in. Got it signed, went down for the enlistment the 1st of July, got to Albuquerque on the 9th of July, the day before I turned 18, and got sworn in. And I knew after seeing all of those pictures, I knew that's what I had to do, and I knew I had to get my picture on that knick-knack shelf and that company picture up on that wall. So the first leave that I had, it wasn't necessarily a leave, it was a little time off from boot camp. You got to go in San Diego. First place I could take my picture, I had it taken and sent that to them. And later when I went out, here's all of these black and white pictures, and there's one little colorized black. It wasn't even a color picture, it was a colorized thing. And there my picture was with them. I felt so proud to see that there, mixing with the family. Well, from boot camp in San Diego, I went to A school in Treasure Island in San Francisco. But, young kid, I didn't apply myself at school. I was having too much fun, so I ended up not completing that school, and then reported on board ship in Norfolk, Virginia as a bosun's mate. But they knew I went about 3/4 of the way through electronics technician school, so they changed and put me in electrician as an ET striker. And that worked pretty good, but my duty watch was in the radio room. And I got so involved in working in the radio room that I ended up changing over to a radioman in there, and that's where I spent the rest of the time in the Navy there. I completed all of the training courses and stuff to make 3rd class, but it wouldn't have made any difference in my duty assignment. We had 3 radiomen, a 1st class, a 3rd class, and then me, a seaman. Well, the 1st class took the 8 to the 1st watch, the 8 to 4. Excuse me. The 3rd class took the 4 to midnight shift. Well, guess which one that left me on? Yeah, I worked the midnight to 8 in the morning shift. So even if I made 3rd class, I'd still have been the junior 3rd class, so that wouldn't have changed. And I was happy. I guess you kind of had to be there a little bit. I was in the Navy. I was shipboard. I was happy. So I didn't worry about taking that final exam and getting 3rd class. Now I wish I had it, but I didn't anyway. The ship I was on was the USS Noxubee. It's an auxiliary oiler, gasoline. It was originally run off the East Coast, spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean when it was first commissioned, and it was really, what it was designed for was shallow water and small craft, small boat fuel transfer. We had some cargo space so we could replenish their stores, and also we would provide them with fuel, because these little ships couldn't get in the wake of the big fleet oilers. I mean, it would swamp them. The water would be so rough they couldn't do it. So that's what we were originally designed to do, as well as shallow water areas where the big tankers couldn't go. We'd carry about a 250,000 gallons of fuel, various types of fuel. We had selected beaches. in the first round, it was over in the Mediterranean. We would go in at high tide. We dropped the stern anchor, which is huge for that size of a ship. Relatively flat bottom. We'd run up and beach that ship at high tide. Tide go out. The fuel trucks would come out on the sandy beach, and we'd pump directly to them. And then they'd leave. When the tide come back in, it'd be easier to float. With the help of that stern anchor and the engines we had, we'd get back off the sandy beach, and off we'd go to the next one. Different operation, but it worked. The ship was originally commissioned in 1945. It's decommissioned in 59. Spence, and then with Vietnam going up, they needed shallow water fueling at a bigger capacity than the little landing craft. The front go down. I can't remember what they call it. But anyway, they make bladder boats out of those, but they couldn't carry enough fuel to be effective. So they brought the little gasoline tankers back, and we went to Vietnam. We were recommissioned in Norfolk, Virginia on September the 10th, 1966. She was pulled out of service on July the 1st, 1975, and sold for scrap with so many of the other ships. So did one run in the eastern part of the country, the up and down the coast in the Mediterranean, and then the second time around she was in Westpac with Virginia, Pearl Harbor as home port, and over to the Philippines, Vietnam, made 3 tours of Vietnam, that ship did. I was on the first one, but said as a kiddie cruiser, my time wouldn't allow me to do another one. The top speed was 14 knots, which translates to about 10 miles an hour. It took us weeks to go from Pearl Harbor or from the Panama Canal to Pearl Harbor. It took weeks to get there at 10 miles an hour. It was not a fast ship. And with it being relatively flat bottom, we couldn't take the rough water too well. It would rise out and then slap down, knock things around, knock you down, everything you could do. But it was home, and she was a good ship. Also, we kind of hard to see it, but my favorite little picture, when we got in Da Nang, the way the Da Nang Harbor was positioned, the way the waves coming in, swells coming in, and where we anchored, we ended up crossways with the wakes, so the boat rocked. And you can see in the picture, it's rocking a little bit. Rock you to sleep, oh boy. If you see a sailor just get off a ship, he's walking down a pier like he's drunk. He's not drunk, he just doesn't have his sea legs. He's still got his sea legs on, hadn't gotten back to normal. But it was a great time. I enjoyed it. I wanted to stay in it. But unfortunately, or not unfortunately, I married my first wife right after that first cruise, 47 years together. Shipboard duty was not inducive to a good marriage. When you're gone 6 to 9 months on a deployment, it's real tough. And I made my choice. I chose my wife and future family over the Navy and went on ahead and got out. But I did have some exciting times. One in particular, the ship has a website, and if you go on that website, there's a lot of stories on there, a lot of stories. But I want to read you one because of all of the time in Vietnam. We were quite concerned going over there because a lot of our stuff, we went out of Da Nang, loaded from those big old huge Chevron and Texaco tankers down to our little, it's like a canoe next to a battleship. But we offloaded and we went up and down the coast to a few marine outposts at the mouth of some rivers, Tan Mai, Cuviet, and Way. And we would double anchor about 50 yards off the beach. get into as shallow as we could get, drop the stern anchor, drop the bow anchor, tighten up, get an underwater line that floated out there, get it up, release the air out of it, hook it up, and pump fuel ashore. And this was the same time that the Viet Cong were firing missiles at destroyers a mile or more out. And we all thought, these guys are nuts. We got 250,000 gallons of fuel, and you could throw a hand grenade or lob a rocket. We're anchored there for 12, 15 hours. But the first time we connected, a Marine come out to communicate back and forth, a communicator between there and the beach. He told us not to worry about that because he knew where the Viet Cong had tapped into that underwater hose, and they would siphon off a couple hundred gallons of fuel to use for their own purpose. So he said, the first that you pump is off the bottom of the tank, so it's dirty anyway. We pump it into a sludge pit. So he said, be sure you pump that stuff. Give them the dirty diesel, and they'll leave you alone to pump the rest of it. And they did. We never had any problems along that line. But we allowed them to take their 4 barrels of dirty diesel and go, and they left us alone. But and this happened several times, but nothing real big. But one night it did. And I've got this story. I'd like to read it. It's about a page and a half. And if I start telling it, I'll start just rambling. So if you don't mind, I'll just read. Now hear this. Now hear this. General quarters, general quarters. All hands man your battle station. This is not a drill. This is not a drill. I can't think of any words that's going to strike deeper into a sailor than that. The most feared words a shipboard sailor can hear. At the sound of these words being piped through the overhead speaker, your heart triples in beats and your stomach is suddenly in your throat. You don't think. You don't allow yourself time to think. You just react. It seems like only seconds you were standing there. This'll help. It seems like only seconds, and you're standing there at your battle station with your battle gear on. Now you think you have to calm yourself down, focus on what's happening, remember and trust your training, and most of all, what the hell is going on? With all our training from Virginia to Vietnam, going to battle station as a drill was nothing new. You did it over and over and over, day or night, until we got it right. And then we did it some more. Our very lives and the life of our ship depended on how well we did it. But nothing really prepares you for those words, this is not a drill. I don't remember the exact date or what pumping station we were at. Maybe in one of those at the mouth of the river. But the Marine base just off the beach, but close enough you could hear their shouts and the sounds of everyday life. Hearing a few gunshots and seeing a parachute flare or two during my mid-watch as a readyman was not unusual. A lot of times I'd take the long headset cord, move out of the confines of the radio room and sit on the starboard bridge wing, which was also my battle station. It's hard to describe how beautiful the night sky was. Stars were always so bright. The waves and the swells that rocked us gently and the sound of the water lapping around the small boats added to the serenity of the scenes. The small boats, usually bladder boats from the Marine Depot, came out at least once for our mid-rats, the midnight rations, which usually consisted of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on fresh baked bread with some soup made from anything that was left over that day. And some of them were quite creative. We were lucky. We had a cook that believed that if you couldn't eat it out of a bowl, it wasn't worth eating. So when he come up with the soups, he did good. And that was the scene that night when suddenly all hell seemed to break loose on the beach. Suddenly from the Marine base came shouting, parachute flares, and a hell of a lot of gunfire. My headphones immediately erupted with the hurried, excited voices telling of an attack on the perimeter of the base. The sky, so tranquil a moment ago, suddenly looked like a ballpark after a 4th of July game. In seconds, the Marine that was on board as our communicator bounded up the ladder, asking for the OOD, or the Officer of the Day. Before he even got the words out, the Officer of the Day was suddenly on the bridge. They talked back and forth for a minute, then the Marine got back to his station to assist in stopping the fuel transfer. They didn't want that fuel running if there was going to be an attack. That had made a heck of a mess. In a few minutes, the captain came up, talked by radio to the Marines ashore, then returned to the other officers that had assembled by then and told them that we needed to go to general quarters, which we were already there. He told us to resume pumping, but to stand by for an emergency disconnect and departure. The Marines had requested that we stand by in case the Viet Cong tried to attack from the beach side of the camp. I wonder what we could do. Our armament was not that impressive. We had several .50 caliber machine guns, some rifles, pistols, and even some grenades. We did have 3-inch 50 not cannons, what am I trying to think? Turrets, guns. 3-inch 50 caliber. I mean, but that short, I don't know, we could have got the barrels down low enough to hit the beach. So we were looking at just using rifles, handguns, and 50 caliber machine guns. And we would have probably been shaken so badly we couldn't hit a thing, but maybe we would have scared them a little bit. I remember glancing over the bridge at the 3-inch guns and wondering what we were going to do with them. See, that's why I read this. If I don't, I skip. Anyway, it seemed so close that night. Adding to all of the commotion, that the small boats from the base come out to the seaward side of the ship for protection. Yeah, I thought, put us between you and them. It was starting to get a little spooky. They would come out to protect the small boats, utility boats, bladder boats, stuff. They'd come out and they'd tie up on the seaward side of the ship rather than take a chance of even just a small grenade sinking one of them. I like to think the attack lasted for about an hour, but as suddenly as it started, it stopped. And for that hour, I was closer to the war than I ever wanted to be. It was a strange feeling to stand there so close to a firefight that you could hear the shouts of orders being given. You can see the tracer shells flashing off into the darkness, the parachute flares popping and floating down, the whine of a ricochet, some coming out our way. And worst of all was the sounds of pain if somebody got hit. It was like watching a battle scene from the movie Green Berets or Apocalypse Now. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't swallow that lump in my throat. Things got deadly quiet for a while, waiting, I guess, for another assault. Then the Marine walkie-talkies started chattering again, and the small boats headed back. We stood down from general quarters, and within a few minutes, all was quiet. I was again alone on the bridge, and it seemed like it never happened, except I still had that lump in my throat, and my knees were shaking from knowing how close I had come to things that I had seen or heard about on the TV. Soon my watch is over, another day started, and everything was as it had been. But I wouldn't be the same, and I'm sure that most of my shipmates would not be the same again either. We didn't talk about it much after that night, we being salty sailors and men and all that, but I imagine that firefight made a lot of us stop and think. We all got closer to the war than we wanted to. And one last thing, I'm sure glad I went to the head before I started my watch that night. So that was my excitement. And I will tell you, I was a good boy My whole enlistment. Only got in trouble one time. But the admiral was very nice and didn't make it tough on me. And I'll paraphrase this, because the dock that the ship was at in Norfolk, Virginia, while it was being the final fitting and the crew coming aboard and getting familiar with the ship and stuff, was at the supply depot at Norfolk Naval Yard. And it was tied up on a pier. To get to the ship from the gate, you could almost throw a rock. It was across on the other side of this one warehouse. But to physically get there, you had to walk, which seemed to get further all the time after we coming back from being on the beach. Had to walk around that warehouse and back down the other side to get to the ship. And as you come around that corner, right there in the middle of all of the warehouses, was this big, beautiful, white, painted area with benches and a flagpole and the two-star admiral's flag hanging on that flagpole. We got to resent that two-star admiral's flag hanging on that flagpole because we had to walk around it every time we come back from the beach or we left to go to the beach. Going to the beach, whip you go by. Coming back, you had to stop and rest. We weren't in quite the same shape coming back as we were when we left. And somebody kept always saying, we ought to take that flag away from him, making us walk. We ought to do that. And it was getting down to the last night, and me and my good buddy were coming back, and we're sitting there on the bench, and we're thinking, this is the last time we're going to have to go around that flag. You know what? We ought to just take it. Be a good souvenir. So we watched the MP Jeep come by, timed it. He come back around. Okay, that's time enough to get to the ship. Come around again. Yep, he's on the same route. All right, we're ready for him. So we sit there. We've already looked at this, and there's no lock on this thing. I mean, we raise the brace, we can jerk that flag down. He was a signalman. He knows how to jerk down flags, so we're in good shape. We sit there, Jeep passes again, right on time. Turns the corner, we jump up, we go over there, we grab that cable, jerk that flag down. That thing was huge. It was huge. Fell over us like a tent. We're wadding it up and walking off, and we got it between us, and we go arm in arm and think, okay, a couple of drunk sailors. And here we go down that pier heading to the ship. We get right to the gangplank, almost to the gangplank, and you can hear that Jeep coming around that corner, speeding down. I thought, oh, boy. And we just stepped on the gangplank. Now, if you're on the gangplank, you're on the ship, and you're safe. But that MP in that Jeep said, hey, sailor, can I talk to you a minute? Well, I stopped, but my buddy just kept on going. So I'm standing there, I'm holding this big flag. He wants to talk. So I'm thinking, oh, man. Okay. Yes, sir. Go back, sit in the Jeep, and he said, what have you got? Well, he knew what I had. So he said, I need to borrow you for a minute. So he turned around and we're driving off from the ship. And I'm thinking, that's the last time I'm going to see that ship. I am in deep water now. We go back to the MP office. He goes in, he gets on the phone. And he said, yes, sir. Yes, Admiral, we have them. We recovered it. 2 enlisted, sir. We have 1. You know, I'm hearing one side of the conversation here. He said, yeah, that tanker, they're leaving tomorrow. Okay. Yes, sir. Will do. Aye, aye. Hangs up the phone. I thought, okay, here it comes. I'm going to be in a brig. Oh, it's over. It's over. He says, well, you're lucky you're leaving tomorrow. I'm to turn you over to the OOD. Okay. obviously leave the flag at the MP's office, and he takes me back to ship. And I asked him, I said, how did you get onto us so quick? And he said, we have that flag taken down so many times by you guys. They cut the trees between the Marine Gate and that flagpole, and they're sitting there watching that flag the whole time. So as soon as we struck that flag, they knew it. I thought, oh, man. We didn't know that. So I got assigned extra duty in the mess deck. It was my job to take the tray when the guys were through eating, pound it off, rinse it off in the scrubber, and pass it on down. Of course, we left, and we were in around Cape Hatteras to go south. So nobody was eating much. A lot of it was left on that tray, plus some extra. I made a lot of that first few days by rail, because it was bad. And then I got extra duty after that, literally scrubbing the floor in our operations department, getting down there with the brush, bucket of water, scrubbing it, doing all that. But at least that was all of it. Nothing ever showed up in the record. My friend, being a signalman, gave me a 2-star pennant flag that I've got at the house. So, but that was the worst trouble I ever got in. So if you're ever in a situation and thinking about that, that flag is a lot bigger than it looks like up on the top of that pole. That thing was a tent. But anyway, the time come we choose to re-enlist or get out, and like I said, I was married at that time. Took my bride, who had never been out of the state of Texas except for a little bit in Oklahoma, took her to Hawaii for 6 months, where we basically honeymooned until it come time for separation, and I told them, send me home. Because it was either that or re-up, because the ship was on its getting ready for second deployment, and at 10 miles an hour, by the time they got over there, I would have been overtime anyway. So that was my Navy experience. So I thank you for giving me the chance to cover that. I love telling stories about it. It was a happy time. It was a great time in my life. And I hate it that the kids coming along after that they just don't know. They don't know our world the way it was, and that the service was something to be proud of and is an honorable service. But once you're in the service, you never really truly leave the service. Your oath of enlistment has no expiration date. The Marines will tell you, once a Marine, always a Marine. They'll tell you. The oath of enlistment, because it is an oath has no expiration date. And so, always been in. It was always a proud time for me.